Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Bukola Jejeloye, and I'm part of the Skoll Foundation team. I'm excited to welcome you this morning to the Skoll World Forum session, ensuring climate commitments reaching the frontline communities. We're honored to have an impressive group of speakers, and I really mean it, very impressive group of speakers here to learn from and to engage with today. Before we move on, just a couple of quick housekeeping items for you all to be aware of. This session is being recorded and will be released publicly after the event. Language translation is available for this session. You can access the translation options in the translation tab to the right of the video window. Please feel free to use chat to engage with each other and post questions to our speakers as they continue in this conversation. The moderator will turn to audience questions towards the end of the session. On social media, we are going to be using the hashtag SkollWF. Again, hashtag SkollWF. And would love for you to do the same and share our message today and for the rest of the week. After the session, you can join small group roundtable discussions on related topics by clicking the Discuss and Meet Up on the left side of the video screen. With all that said, I'm now happy to turn this over to the moderator of this session, Mr. Brady Pinheiro Walkinshaw, climate leader and former CEO of GRIST. Brady, thank you.
Well, thank you so much. It is such a pleasure to be here with you all, and it's going to be really wonderful to facilitate this conversation with four extraordinary leaders working across the climate community and thinking about how we bring frontline voices, frontline solutions to solving the climate crisis. So I'm Brady Pinheiro Walkinshaw. I'm thrilled to be with you all. Normally, I'm based in Seattle. I had the privilege and honor of leading GRIST for many years. I'm currently with the Emerson Collective working on climate and really pleased to be with this group of people. So thank you to the Skoll Global Forum. Thank you to the Skoll Foundation for having us. To kick us off, we thought we would set the framing a bit. And the session today is really focused on ensuring how climate commitments at all levels reach frontline communities. With the growing urgency we have to meet global climate targets, we've increasingly focused on the outsized role of Indigenous peoples and local communities, thinking about the role that they play in protecting the world's biodiversity, defending our ecosystems, conserving natural solutions, and advancing policies and priorities which will help to mitigate and reduce emissions and help us build resilience in communities to adapt to the climate crisis. Historically, however, these communities have received but a fraction of total climate financing. In this panel, we'll hear from philanthropists, government leaders, intermediaries, frontline activists who are working to ensure that climate commitments are reaching those who are most affected, and in many, many ways, at the forefront of the movements that are fighting the climate crisis in communities around the world. So I'm really thrilled to kick off this discussion. You can include chats. You can put chats from the audience. You can put your chats in the comments. I'll be going through those. I'll bring those into the discussion as they come up, and we'll certainly leave time for them at the end. So I wanted to kick off by introducing four of the terrific leaders who are here with me today. First, I wanted to introduce my colleague, Rukka. She is the first female Secretary General of the Indigenous Peoples Alliance of the Archipelago, the world's largest Indigenous Peoples organization at the national level. She has been at the forefront of a lot of very important climate work over the years in social movements, and we are really thrilled to have her here with us to share her perspectives. So we will speak more with Rukka as we go into the discussion. The second is that I'm thrilled to introduce Solome Lemma. Solome is the executive director of Thousand Currents, which is a really innovative organization that is moving resources into grassroots partners globally, and has been at the forefront of a lot of really important thinking of how it is that philanthropic resources can reach the leaders and communities that are on the front lines of fighting the climate crisis. So welcome, Solome. We also have Gillian Caldwell joining us, who has a long history in working on the government and the public sector side of supporting climate work. She is with the United States Agency for International Development, where she is the Deputy Assistant Administrator, and she is the Chief Climate Officer for USAID, and has been in a variety of really important roles there over the years, and I think brings really valuable perspective, and particularly from a bilateral donor, to this discussion. So welcome, Gillian. And then last, we have Jennifer Corpuz. Last but not least, we have Jennifer Corpuz, who's a senior global policy and advocacy lead for an organization you'll hear more about in this discussion, Tero, which is working globally to support indigenous leadership and indigenous ownership of land to help advance natural solutions and policy wins and storytelling, and a lot of really important efforts that raise the voices and build the power of indigenous communities globally. So we're really pleased to have the four of you with us. So as we kick off, I thought that I would just start with an opening question to our panelists. So the first question I wanted to ask is that there is indeed a lot to be distressed about in the world right now. And we could approach that from the most recent IPCC report to global events in Europe, to other things that we're deeply struggling with as a society right now. But what is it that you're feeling hopeful about? So I thought I would start with Solome first, and we can go around.
Thank you, Brady, and hello, everyone. It's good to be here with you today. I wish I could see you, but I'm feeling your energy here. That's a great question. I think particularly in these moments of compounding and complex challenges, hope is what I'm holding on to very tightly and dearly. And one of my greatest sources of hope is really our partners. Thousand Currents supports grassroots groups and movements working for climate justice, food sovereignty, and economic justice. And I'm deeply inspired by their leadership and their ingenuity. I'm inspired by how they use whatever tools are available to them to advance climate solutions. For example, a few weeks ago, one of our partners in South Africa, called the Amadiba Crisis Committee, won a big case in the South African courts because they challenged oil explorations in the sea line, or the coastal line near KwaZulu-Natal, and the court agreed with them because they agreed that indigenous communities and local communities haven't been properly consulted, and there hasn't been enough evidence to show that there won't be harm to marine life and fishing industries and livelihoods. And this is a small organization that organized large masses of people and used strategic litigation to advance protection of our climate. I'm inspired by partners who are able to forge a seat or create a seat at a table that wasn't designed for them. One of our partners in Peru, Fenmukarinap, recently saw that when Peru passed the climate change framework law, which incorporated its commitments to the Paris Agreement, indigenous communities were not properly represented. So they organized indigenous organizations across Peru and were able to create the Indigenous Climate Panel, which for the first time has a seat at the national policy table and is playing a consultative role. And that's just one way in which this indigenous women's rights organization is claiming power and making sure all voices are represented. And just lastly, I'm really inspired by how our partners continue to dream and imagine new ways of being. They know that we can do better. We have a group in Nepal called the Digo Pikas Institute, which is a youth organization that's organizing young people, that's helping them get involved in research and in policy, that's building networks and coalitions across sectors, that's experimenting around what it means to build green cities and livable cities, and what it means to build a Nepal that is entirely green. And it's just a group of young people who believe that we can be better and do better as humanity, and so do I.
Thank you. Jennifer, maybe go to you.
Thanks, Brady, and early morning from the Philippines. And yes, I'm just coming from negotiations in Geneva, and this is the first time that negotiators under the Convention on Biological Diversity came came together physically in 2.5 years. And, while the meeting was frustrating, what gave me hope was that there was quite robust Indigenous participation there. And you could see really Indigenous leaders telling their stories about, how conservation has impacted them, but at the same time, how respect for their rights hold the solution to a lot of the world's problems nowadays. One of the really good outcomes coming out of Geneva is the unusually strong support for Indigenous rights to be reflected in this new strategic plan that's being negotiated that would guide biodiversity action moving forward. Um, then we see you talked about the IPCC report, Brady, and it's apocalyptic as usual, but it was unusual in the sense that Indigenous peoples' role in combating climate change was unusually visible in the summary for policymakers. There's a strong call for Indigenous participation in planning how to best reforest denuded lands, and it cites the outsized ability of Indigenous peoples to stop deforestation that fuels climate change, as we know, biodiversity loss, and the risk of future pandemics. So we see all of these studies and all of these conclusions from these policy processes that recognizes the role that recognize the role of Indigenous peoples, and at the same time, you see Indigenous peoples really claiming their roles, their spot in bringing solutions to all of these, the biodiversity as well as the climate crisis. So that really gives me hope.
Thank you. Gillian, could we go to you next?
Sure. Well, thanks so much for having me. You, I think, erroneously said I had a long time history in government, and I wanted to point out I'm actually brand new to government, and that's part of the reason that I'm hopeful. I'll get to that in a minute. First, I want to give a big shout out to all of our Skoll awardees, a community that's so important to me, and especially to those of you who had the ingenuity to gather in person in Terrytown. 100 of you, as I understand it. But, as was already mentioned, it's really code red for humanity when it comes to the climate crisis. So it is hard to have hope. But I think at a minimum, as social entrepreneurs and as change agents, we have to suspend some disbelief. We have to have a sort of a dogged belief in our potential to make a difference in the world. Maybe we even have to be slightly delusional to continue doing what we do. But the reason I came to government and the reason I feel hopeful right now is, first of all, the US is back in action when it comes to climate after some very tough years on many fronts in the United States, but notably with respect to our lack of engagement on climate action. And at USAID, where I now work, we've got a $27.6 billion budget. We have 10,000 staff. We have offices in 100 countries worldwide. And Administrator Samantha Power, who heads our agency, is repeatedly referring to us as a climate agency, by which she means all of us, all hands on deck, need to be focused on what our power and potential is to drive a difference when it comes to the climate crisis. And I'm hopeful because we're just about to release a strategy which will take us through 2030 with really ambitious goals. We want to reduce carbon emissions by 6 billion tons. That's the equivalent of all US emissions in an entire year. We want to protect 100 million hectares of critically biodiverse landscape that store and sequester carbon. We want to increase the resilience of 500 million people worldwide to the really shocking and ongoing impacts of the climate crisis. Catalyze $150 billion in public and private finance. That's so important because the IPCC says we need $5 trillion a year by 2030. That's a 590% increase on where we are right now. And I think really importantly for this conversation, I'm hopeful because USAID is actually centering our strategy for the climate crisis and the agency writ large in principles of equity, diversity, inclusion, and localization. So we have a goal to ensure systems changing interventions in 40 countries worldwide to increase the participation and engagement of marginalized communities, and a special goal to ensure that we increase our support and engagement for Indigenous communities, which, as Jennifer already said, are critical to stewarding ecosystems. I mean, Indigenous communities manage over 25% of the world's land surface, which is 40% of all terrestrial protected areas. And research shows that the territories owned and managed by Indigenous peoples are better preserved with respect to diversity and carbon sequestration potential. So I'm really excited for what we can do together in partnership with so many communities around the world, and especially so many frontline communities that have been too often overlooked in the context of the development aid industry. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And my moderator apologies for the for the introduction. I should say, Gillian, for many years led Global Witness, which is a really extraordinary organization that has done a lot of work protecting frontline folks on the very front lines of exposing really awful work on it from the extractives industry. So Rukka, please.
Sorry, mic turned off. What keeps me feeling hopeful is the resiliency of Indigenous peoples during this very difficult time. We already having the historical climate change impact on all of us as the global citizens. Doesn't matter whoever we are. And then on top of that, we have this pandemic, right? But what happened during this difficult time is, even when the cities are actually falling apart, the Indigenous peoples who are still having control over our resources and territories, we are thriving. I would say COVID-19 is actually the friends of Indigenous peoples, because this is the time. That's my dog agreeing to my statement, sorry. Because this is the time that we get all the answers that what we are doing is the right thing. Especially during the time when we have the most serious case of Delta. Me, as a citizen who live in the city, we remain eating rice, because we get rice being sent from the village, from our Indigenous communities, our coffee, our even vegetables. At some point, we get a lot mini truck of vegetables sent from the community. So we had to go around in our neighborhood in the city to distribute the food, because we cannot finish all of them. So what what keep me hopeful is, this is the evidence of the resiliency of Indigenous peoples. If we still have control over our land and territories, we will prosper, and we have the chance to take care of others. And this has been really the missions. This has been the purpose of our life as Indigenous peoples. And I think these are the things. And I see we have our youth, Indigenous youth, who like 15 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, they say, I'm fed up with the city. I want to go home to my homeland. And I said, what are you going to do? Even me was being skeptical. But now they become small they are thriving. They become small entrepreneurs. They are planting. They become farmers. They have everything basically and they are far away from the pandemic, because we also have that system that we call indigenous isolation systems. And so these are the things that keeps me feeling hopeful. And actually it's the most effective antidepressant in the last at least more than 2 years now. So that's my take on this, feeling hopeful. And I hope everybody will feel the same as well, because this is really the time when we feel like us as community, wherever we are, that's the thing that keeps us alive, the solidarity, taking care of each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Rukka. Jennifer, I thought we would go to you to start on the next question, but next I thought we would just open up a discussion around how we understand the field and how we understand supporting frontline communities and how we've seen that change, and even your reflections coming back from Geneva. How have you seen it change over the past decade?
Yes. Well, maybe a couple of things I left out in my statement about what gives me hope is in Glasgow, you see this forests and land tenure pledge for Indigenous peoples and local communities. So that was a 1.7 billion pledge to give money as directly as possible to Indigenous communities to support tenure, and Tero is part of that. And then we had the Protecting Our Planet Challenge, which is 5 billion pledge to help implement protection of 30% of land and sea by 2030, with due respect for Indigenous rights. So and those are representative of some of the big changes that we've been seeing nowadays. So I cited the scientific evidence earlier, and now funding agencies are also trying to follow the science and follow the evidence. But the question, so you asked me to define the issues, is how to deliver the support most effectively. No, because we still struggle with, as an Indigenous person myself who had to go through this whole sending project proposals, implementing, sending financial reports, etc. There's a lot to be done in making the processes simpler. We see a lot of hope among the philanthropies that are part of these pledges, because we hear of developments now where, some philanthropic organizations no longer require written concept notes, proposals, budgets, for example. For trusted Indigenous organizations, it's enough for someone to go to that philanthropy and say that this is something that we want to do, or if Indigenous lives are under threat because of their defense of territory, they say we need a legal defense fund or a sanctuary fund. And there's this movement towards simplifying all of these processes so that we can deliver support more effectively to the front lines. And we're trying our best also as a foundation, Tero, and we try our best to align ourselves with the vision of Indigenous peoples and to make the granting process as simple as possible. So that's maybe in terms of defining the issues. It's great that there are pledges, but there's a lot to be done to make sure that the systems are simplified. We hear a lot of times it's a matter of capacity of Indigenous organizations, and we need to build the capacity of Indigenous organizations to access the resources. But I think there has to be a middle ground somewhere. We have to meet halfway. No, those that provide the resources have to adjust, and of course, maybe Indigenous peoples have to build capacities in some way. But you see Aman here with Rukka. There are some that are really very capable already. But yeah, that's those are my insights.
Maybe Gillian, in the context of kind of bilateral, multilateral aid, as you've seen this, how have you seen this shift over the past decade, and how are you looking at advancing that within USAID?
Yeah, so this is a very live conversation since Administrator Power announced new commitments on localization, one of which is to ensure that 50% of the projects we're engaged in are either directed by or dominantly informed by local communities. Also, a goal to ensure that 25% of the funding that USAID disperses goes to local communities. That might sound actually pretty paltry, 25 out of 100, but we're nowhere near that right now. And, larger aid agencies, for the reasons described, because of the sort of the cumbersome nature of the proposal and reporting requirements, tend to work through larger intermediaries. I absolutely agree that we need to simplify our process. We just launched a new website at www.workwithusaid.org that is a first effort to simplify the process and demystify the process of engaging and working with USAID. And we're very closely involved right now in doing all we can to streamline those requirements. I think on this question of capacity and building capacity, the question I have is capacity to do what? I mean, the organizations that we're talking about empowering Indigenous communities, for example, have plenty of capacity. They have capacity to make a difference in their communities and to drive very meaningful change. They may or may not have the capacity to process large volumes of money and engage in a government-sponsored audit. But can we suspend audit requirements for smaller grants? That's an active conversation within USAID. Can audit requirements be suspended for folks that receive money through intermediary organizations? I think the other thing we need to think about also is the risk that local and frontline communities face in receiving foreign funds, either government funds or private funds, may actually jeopardize those organizations. So requirements of transparency and publication regarding funding have to be reconsidered. And generally speaking, first and foremost, we need to consider the safety and well-being of the communities that we're supporting. So I think when we talk about, just to double back to capacity, when we talk about building capacity, I also wonder about the logic of building the capacity to function on the scope and scale of the kind of NGO industrial complex. Sometimes the organizations that most need and deserve the support are functioning at a community level in highly dispersed ways, not leaderless, but leaderful, with a more collective approach to leadership and action. And I think we should be careful about forcing organizations like that to reinvent themselves to fit our model. So those are the kinds of tough questions we're grappling with at USAID right now.
And building that, Rukka, maybe over to you. I mean, there is this definite movement afoot, and has been over the past decade, to kind of shift power and resources to local communities. In your work in leading a large Indigenous Peoples Alliance, have you felt that? I mean, what are some of the challenges that you've encountered, and how have you seen that, or have you?
The nature of the struggle of us as Indigenous peoples actually remains the same, and even much more critical now, because we are really on the front line of everything. We are demanded to continue to keep the environment, the ecosystem in the good conditions, but we are lacking of recognitions. Even our contributions that we, as Gillian mentioned earlier, Jing also mentioned earlier, even our contributions to keep the 80% of the remaining biocultural diversity is not being recognized properly. Also, we continue to face the situations of criminalizations, land grabbing, losing control of our ancestral land. And especially now, we do have the situations when people call it shrinking democratic space, shrinking political space. In Indonesia now, the decision makers, the government and the parliament, they are making decisions, taking advantage of our inability to influence, to control our policymakers, to make all these bad decisions that will even take away the rest of the thing that we have now, our territories. The new capital, the call it law creations, it's all fake narrative. It will put huge and serious pressure on us. And we are talking about the fate, not just our fate as Indigenous peoples, but the fate of the rest of the world. Why I'm saying this? Because when you talk, the challenge that we have with donors in this time when we need the support the most, all the things that I have heard, that we are transitioning, we are changing all these modalities and things, it's still remaining, how you call it, very jargons, because I haven't seen much of this in terms of in the experience of Aman, especially from bilateral donors. Yeah, we continue to hear that we have this pledge, but where is the money? And why the money is not be seen by indigenous organizations like us? Because I think we need to address the power relations now, that we are all donors. We are all taking care of each other. Yeah, the donor, the perceptions of donor, that giving out. I think this, we need to address these perceptions. Yeah, we cannot be seen as indigenous people of being pitiful, or a donors as being generous. No, we are now, this is the collective actions of all of us. Yeah, we have our contributions as indigenous peoples, and donors also have their contributions. These are the resources that we need the most to take care of our mother earth, and to take care of everybody of us, especially our future generations. So when we speaking of challenge, yeah, we do have, we do have private philanthropies. Yeah, like, well, I must say, like, for example, Skoll. Yeah, we have Thousand Currents just recently contacted us, and these are all like, okay, this is unrestricted budget. You can do whatever you want to do. And for us, it's like, are you serious? You nuts?
I'm serious.
Oh, that's serious saying serious. But the problem is this is just the small practice, yeah, of the very few of philanthropy, and this is mainly the private philanthropy. What we want to see is, because this trend also should be within the bilateral donors. And why is this? This is what we call, I remember a friend of mine, I said, how do you call this? You have to do this, all this thing. You have to prove that you are not good to corrupt. You have to, because, and he said, this is what we call hyper accountability. Hyper accountability. You need to prove everything. In the end of the day, yeah, indigenous peoples, organizations like me, we are not ending up saving our environment or saving our indigenous brothers and sisters. We are ending up serving, providing reports, writing reports, trying to prove. And I think this is again rooted in the power relations between donors and us as indigenous peoples. This we need to put ourselves in the equal positions, and also I think this also indicates the lack of trust. Yeah, because we haven't got the money. We only write the proposal and concept notes, and they also, you have to make sure that you're not going to steal my money. You have to prove that you have this, that you're not going to corrupt. It's really like we are we are being portrayed as the greatest corruptors ever. So and that's really the feeling that we get when you are being like, no, you have to prove, where is your a policy on this? You have to make sure that you're not going to rape somebody else. You're not going to. This is I think very necessary, but very, I call it overkill. Yeah, hyper accountability, and this is the challenge that we do have, and we still have. And why this money is not reaching us is because these things will be met, the requirement will be met by big organizations. Yeah, so that's why the report that's saying that only drops and drips of the money that is saying for indigenous peoples and local community is actually reaching us, the community. So this is not my challenge alone, but this is also the challenge of all of us, of the donors, of a people who provided the money, and us, the human rights defenders and environmental defenders, climate defenders on the ground.
Yeah.
And we need to work this out together. But I think the first thing is we need to address the power relation, and we need to trust, and we need to have stronger solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rukka. Solome, I mean, you've been at the front of trying to shift this power for a long time, and maybe you could.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, thank you to all of my colleagues. Everything they said resonates with me. I think, I think when we think about our work in philanthropy or aid, the first important recognition is to recognize in many ways this work is rooted in a colonial legacy, right? And because it's rooted in that there are practices, assumptions, and processes we've inherited that we have to interrogate and work to shift. And I'm really encouraged by the increasing discourse in our sector about moving money to the front lines of change, moving money to Indigenous peoples, moving money to social movements and grassroots organizations. This is exactly where we need to be given the type of crisis that we're facing. But as my colleagues have said, to do that well, we have to also shift ourselves as donors. And Thousand Currents is an intermediary that raises money to move money to frontline organizations. And so I think what I want to touch on right now is three areas of challenges that often come up in our sector, and areas that we need to shift. One is assumptions, processes, and practices. By assumptions, I think Gillian and Jennifer already touched on this. There are assumptions that we make about capacity, right? And as they said rightfully, the conversation needs to be about how do we build our capacity to work with communities as opposed to inquiring about their capacity to do the work, because we know, and they've proven to us time and again, that those who are most impacted by such challenges often have the most effective solutions. They understand it intimately and can advance solutions that are intersectional, interconnected, and effective. But it is us who need to build our capacity to work with them and to be in right relationship with them. The one thing about capacity that we need to really continue to think about is this idea of absorptive capacity. So it's not just an organization's capacity to do the work, but the idea that they can't take significant amount of capital because they don't know how to manage it. And that's rooted in the mistrust that Rukka was just touching on. And we often ask that question of groups that are led by communities of color or groups in the global south, right? What is your absorptive capacity? An opportunity for us is to really reframe that in this moment and recognize, instead of asking what's your absorptive capacity, it's what's the capacity of your vision? What do you need for us to invest in? Because the greatest risk we have right now is not necessarily losing our money by investing in one organization that might not have accomplished what we thought they would, but it's rather inaction. It's the risk is doing the same thing. The risk is not moving money to where it needs to go, to frontline communities. So really thinking about and reframing this concept of absorptive capacity. We often hear from donors that we don't know how to reach frontline communities. Where are they? And there are many ways to find them. And one is to work through intermediaries like Thousand Currents and many others who have historical experience, expertise, and networks of working with communities. Another thing that needs to shift about our assumptions is this idea of scale. Well, there's some solutions that are small and localized, but we need scalable responses, scalable solutions to respond to the climate crisis. Again, we need to interrogate and shift how we define and understand scale. Traditionally, we've understood scale to be something that's delivered through kind of a single entity. It's vertical, linear. What community groups show us is that scale can look different. Scale can be decentralized. Scale can be about influence, right? We've got partners who are operating work locally in their communities, but they're part of a broader global network that's advocating for farmers' rights. And that's how they reach decentralized or dispersed scale. So I think in this moment for us as funders, there's an opportunity for us to really rethink what we mean by capacity, scale, and reach of our partners. And I won't get too much into the practices, but as my colleagues have said, just the burdensome processes and practices are difficult for our partners, but also practices that have us siloing our strategies and our responses, right? We know climate is inherently interconnected and intersectional. Climate is connected to food systems, it's connected to transportation system, climate is connected to gender justice. So really thinking about how do we break through the silos and make the connections that are needed, because often community groups that are working on the climate crisis may not be positioning their work or talking about it as a singular climate strategy. They may be talking about it as a well-being strategy because they understand we need well-being of the planet and communities and land for us to address this ecological crisis that we're in. So understanding and making the connection allows us to find groups where they are and meet them and how they articulate the work as opposed to how we frame it and understand it. And lastly, I think just around processes, the one thing that's often getting in the way of us funding and reaching communities is the need for evidence and data, which is really important, right? But we often discount the data that's coming from communities, the data that's rooted in hundreds of years of practice and history, but also that we let that in some ways paralyze us, right? We're looking for the right strategy, the right approach. And the right approach and strategy right now is just to move the money and learn while we're moving the money to communities. So let me stop there for now. And Brady, I can follow up if you have any other questions.
Powerful. I think the thread on scale is really provocative, really important for us to sit with. But Gillian was going to jump in with some thoughts on trust.
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, yes to everything Solome just said. But I wanted to highlight the trust-based philanthropy principles that are really, I think, gaining some currency, as it were, in the philanthropic terrain. There's 6 core principles, which are really important. One is giving multi-year unrestricted funding. That is the kind of support that NGOs need in order, especially ones that are trying to drive systems changing interventions. It takes a long time and you need the flexibility to adapt to your context. Another principle is really to do the homework. If we spend our own time as donors understanding who these organizations are and what their history is, and make sure that when we invite a proposal, we're fairly certain there's a good fit. They won't waste time jumping through hoops for us. Another, I think, is really simplifying and streaming paperwork. That's another core trust-based philanthropy principle. We've discussed that already. Being transparent and responsive to our potential recipients is huge. I think soliciting and acting on feedback, that's another of the principles. It's not enough just to ask for the feedback. You've got to incorporate that if you're going to bother to ask. And also, finally, really offering support beyond the check. So that's, responsive and adaptive, non-monetary support to bolster leadership and capacity and organizational health. And sometimes organizations really don't know what they can ask for, what is possible, beyond the check that a donor may be writing. So the question becomes, how can you have the kinds of conversations that invite them to be honest with you about other needs they have that you might be able to support them with? So anyway, just a big encouragement for donors, especially, to look up trust-based philanthropy and adopt those principles.
I wanted to open it up if others on the panel want to come in on Solome or Gillian's comments around scale and trust.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on the issue of trust. And it's funny because for us, it was the reverse. We had to spend a lot of time introducing ourselves to partners so that they gain, so that they learn to trust us and not the other way around. Because, the first step because we're an organization that supports Indigenous guardianship, right? And supports land tenure for Indigenous peoples. So we look at the places that need the support the most. So, and the first obvious thing is the Amazon, for example, and then you have large ocean spaces in the Pacific. Yeah, and we know that these places are critical. We know that there are people there who are managing and who are governing their traditional territories. So we go to them and we just spend this time trying to gain their trust and not the other way around. The next step is to just align ourselves with their vision and try not to impose what we want to happen to the community. So we spent a lot of time just talking to them about the vision for their territories and for their communities. And we try to align our grant making with that vision. And then the last issue is when we started talking about monitoring and indicators, they said that the mainstream indicators, they won't do. For example, GDP, $1 per day income, monetary income, those are not appropriate at all. So they started a process to develop their own biocultural indicators. For example, the ability to carry out their rituals, the ability to access their traditional rangelands. For example, I think there's a lot to be done around data as well. What do we monitor? How do we align it with the values of the frontline communities, Indigenous peoples? So that's something that it's a work in progress for us. But yeah, everything resonates.
Go ahead, Rukka. Were you going to jump in?
Yeah, I think there are some for me the way I see it, as I mentioned earlier, the challenges. It's about trust, it's about the power relations, but there are actually some technical things that we can use to address. Yeah, and why? I mean, I. I will never give up to say that we do have capacity. Yeah, I don't. What we need to do is improvement, expanding, finding options, and strengthening capacity. Yeah, we do have the capacity. We've been proved our capacity for millennials. Yeah, so I think it's really discouraged to continue calling us don't have capacity. Yeah, we do have capacity, but we are different capacity. We are unmatched. That is capacity requirement that is dictated by outsiders. And I think Jing just explained that very well. For example, like this, I just give you one small story. There is one place, very remote area up in the mountain, that is reached if you walk by foot. It's like 2 weeks, and if you rent a motorbike, you have to pay like $150. Yeah, and we can, if we support that community, because they need to buy, for example, a coffee grinder that is worth $500, because the donors ask us that we need to have the receipts first. They have to spend $300 just to bring out the receipts. So these are just actually mechanics that we can address. But again, we need to open the options. Yeah, we have to be given the chance to discuss and to have dialogues. Like, look, you say you need this, right? But there are other ways that we can prove. And this is also actually because Aman, we unfortunately we received most of restricted budget money donors, so we have to do all these things. But once we try to make sure to convince our community members, saying that this is about accountability, not that I'm against accountability, I am very much for accountability, but we need to find the flexible and simple way and most appropriate that is doable with indigenous community. In Indonesia, we are the only one organizations that we publish every 2 months of our financial statement to public. So if you have internet, you can see, yeah, and then this is the matter of our transparency. But we are able with our own very simple system, we are able to disburse money. And speaking of scaling, I do believe in small is beautiful, and many small beautiful multiply by 1,000 is better than one big multiply by one. So I do believe, because small is beautiful, also the reflections of diversity of the situations of indigenous peoples, and the reflections of diverse ability to report, to prove accountability. Yeah. When I say hyper accountability, not that I am not for that. We in Aman, accountability, transparency is our highest standard. But when we work with indigenous community, we have to apply different system. Yeah, they don't, because they don't have computer. How they're going to write report? Yeah, so I call them and I write down. This is what they're saying. Or if they have camera, phone camera, they just take the pictures and send me to prove that they have done all the things. These are the things, very creative reporting system that we can open. But once the big donors remaining business as usual as before, we are going to stuck in the same problems again. And that's actually why in Indonesia, when speaking of, it's also very important to decide what we want to do. So currently, three organizations of indigenous peoples and local community environment in Indonesia, which is AMAN, Indigenous Community, and then the peasant organization, Agrarian Reform, KPA, and Friends of the Earth Indonesia. We are setting up our what we call indigenous peoples and local community direct fund to Indonesia. So we are trying our best, to how little money do we have. We need to have the mechanisms to channel it directly to our communities because they are the one that need the most. Thank you.
Thank you, Rukka. We have about 6 or 7 minutes left, and we have all of a sudden a bunch of questions coming in that are all really great, that are broadly around recommendations for philanthropy to be more effective. There's one that just came in from Stephanie that was about talking about how donors, countries, foundations, individual philanthropists can incorporate the latest IPCC findings into their climate commitments and work with frontline communities. There's questions coming in around more efficient coordination. There's questions coming in around better models of funding frontline communities. So my thought was we could just maybe go around, maybe starting with we'll start with Gillian and then go to Jennifer and then Solome and then Rukka. We can give you the final word just on some practical recommendations and thoughts on the way forward. So maybe we'll start with you, Gillian.
Yeah, well, NDCs are on my mind. Those are nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. I'm actually at the NDC Partnership Steering Committee right now in Jamaica, where we're talking about the challenge of providing the technical and financial support that governments and communities need to be able to step up their ambition, because we're not where we need to be to keep global warming anywhere near 1.5 degrees. But I really think donors need to be laser focused on how we're going to ensure delivery on the most ambitious NDCs. And, that's going to be a key focus. A part of our strategy at USAID is actually to ensure that in all 80 countries where we have missions, those missions are providing the technical and financial support that the countries need to either ramp up their ambition or to deliver on the commitments they've already made. I think part of the reason we see every COP ring fenced by perfectly legitimate protests is that we've just had our 26th COP and emissions keep rising. So we need to be, moving beyond empty promises and towards very swift and significant action. And by the way, if we keep the most important data in mind, such as the data we already discussed, which is that indigenous communities are the most effective stewards of the Earth's biodiversity and currently inhabiting some of the most critical carbon sinks in the world, we will be getting our funding to the right places. I also think, while this is complicated and we could have a much longer conversation about it, we have to recognize the fact that we will not get where we need to go without private finance. And so I think donors need to think about blended finance, what we can do to pave the way for more adaptation related and mitigation related investments from private finance. We're not going to get to 5 trillion with the government money out there. That's a much longer conversation, but it's a key focus for us. And I've just convened all the Nordic donors in Oslo last week, and they're excited to work with us to think more creatively about what we can do to bring private investors to the table here. So that's all.
Thank you. Jennifer.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on one of the questions here about overconsumption, how to address overconsumption in the north, while at the same time, getting resources for those in the South to continue doing what they've been doing for millennia to indigenous communities. And I think both need to be addressed, but we also have to recognize that there's a connection there. There's a connection. Oil and gas, a lot of times, comes from indigenous communities, and protecting indigenous rights means that, to a certain extent, overconsumption may be curbed, but at the same time, you are protecting the environment, preventing climate change. Um, Food, for example, I think everyone knows very well the connection between beef and climate change, right? The hunger for beef in northern countries and climate change. So that's been causing a lot of clear cutting of the Amazon rainforest. And just recognize that there's a connection there. And just because you're pouring money into indigenous peoples in the South to protect their territories doesn't mean you're ignoring the problems in the North. It contributes. It's linked. So yeah, I think I said a lot about how philanthropies can adjust. Everyone has said it: decolonize, trust, adjust your systems, adjust your metrics for measuring, decolonize data. So I don't need to reiterate all of those, but yeah.
Thank you, Jennifer. Solome.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. You said much of what I was going to say. I think one important recognition, one work we have to do mentally and emotionally is accept that this moment is calling all of us to change, and that if we're able to solve this crisis, it's because we have fundamentally realigned power and dispersed power. And on the other side, we will all be changed, and we will all hold different positions and roles in society. And I think that's a hard thing to accept, but mentally it's about fundamental shifts in how society is structured. So trust must lead to that. Capacity must lead to that. Everything Jennifer said. And the only other thing that I would add is remember, climate is not a technical challenge, it's an adaptive, complex challenge, which means it requires long-term commitment. It requires many different actors and leaders and many different types of organizations and sectors for us to address it. So develop funding strategies that reflect that, the long-term commitment, the adaptation, provide core flexible support if there's anything, core unrestricted support. And lastly, I often resist this language of what's the big bet, because there isn't going to be one thing that's going to help us solve this. But if you are attached to a big bet big on communities, bet big on movements. Fund them because you know they can win. And to borrow from Ashley Henderson, really fund them like you believe they can win, which means fund them at scale. Fund them in amounts and sizes that you never thought you would fund, because that's what the moment requires.
Great. Rukka, why don't you close us?
Thank you so much. I think I will again emphasize on the trust, yeah. But really, it is important to feel like this is our responsibility together, yeah. And I think Jennifer pointed out about overconsumptions earlier is really on point. I'm sometimes I'm thinking like, okay, so we are the one who will have to defend our territories and land and our forests with our blood and tears and everything. And people in the north, they will keep on like doing whatever they want to do, and that is what so-called upset. And then again, we have these climate change solutions that we need to do the carbon market. I mean, that's another headache. I mean, serious threat to us. So, and supporting us, we need to be. I mean, we are human being. We have the ability to adapt, including donors. Yeah, donors will they cannot keep on saying like, no, but we cannot do this because we are public money. We use we have to do this. I mean, those are for me technicalities, and I can offer I mean, solutions how to go beyond that technicalities. But it's really the commitment to change, yeah, to transform, and it should be based on the awareness that we can rely on each other. Yeah, we can. It's not just indigenous or local communities, but it's really all of us as a community, because this is our only home. Yeah, and if we start everything with lack of trust, we are not going to go anywhere. So we need to keep that in mind. So it's been very interesting also years for us, because we also need to adapt and change a lot. And I mean, if Aman can do it, why everybody one cannot do it. And I believe we all can. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you to the Skoll Global Forum. Thank you to these wonderful panelists, leaders, thinkers. Thank you to Lindsay Ojok at the Skoll Foundation who made this panel happen. And then there are 2 more roundtable discussions after this where folks can continue this discussion if you'd like to carry this on. And those are coming. One is called Community-Centric Decisions to Combat the Climate Crisis. And then the other one is about financing adaptation. So thank you all so much. And it's been wonderful to spend this hour with you.
Thanks for having us. Thanks for coming, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Brady. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.